Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we'll be once again updating the Survivor 42 power rankings following episode 4. And admittedly, there wasn't as much movement, or at least not with most people compared to last week. There are a couple changes here or there that we'll get into, but for the most part, I feel like this was a pretty standard week. But let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So, starting at the list at number 14, we have the boot from this week. We have Swati. And I know that it's Swati pretty high in my power ranking so far to the season, but admittedly, it's not too surprising that she's a pre-merge boot here. Obviously, in this past episode, she talks to Tori about the vote, has a confessional about feeling like she's on the outs. She plans to vote out Drea if they go back to tribal due to her extra vote. She suggests pulling in Roxroy, which Tori isn't comfortable with, but Tori does talk to Roxroy, tells Drea about the extra vote. Later on, she tells Tori that Drea was the one to pull together a four-person alliance to vote out Tori at the first tribal. Tori admits that Swati is her closest ally, but then later on, Roxroy talks to Drea about Tori talking about the extra vote. She has a confessional about how Tori has loose lips. She doesn't trust her anymore, and while she doesn't want to lose her, she isn't willing to sink her own game to keep Tori around. Later on, after Romeo and others start targeting her, she notices others are talking, has a confessional about wanting to save herself, talks to Drea, and says that Tori tries to blindside her and how she's using this to drive a wedge between them. At Tribal, she uses her shot in the dark, however, it doesn't work, and she's voted out. And overall, Swati was a somewhat interesting figure in the edit. Now, I think she had a lot of potential based on her strong Grimir, with her getting personal content and seemingly getting some credit for getting Roxroy on board with the Zack vote. And while I thought episode 2 presented some red flags with her getting set up for turning on Dre at some point, I felt like as long as Ika went with the easier targets like Roxroy, Tori, or even possibly Romeo, I felt like she would have been fine. But it's really just her getting set up to be in this battle with Drea, and me thinking that Drea has more longevity in her edit than Swati. I feel like if that battle were to happen, that Swati would lose, be in a lot of trouble, and be voted out. And sure enough, that happens where Dreas is able to get the numbers on our side and Swati is voted out. And I think Swati on the whole is an alright player. While I don't think she did a ton wrong to be voted out, I feel like she definitely did stuff that made certain people not trust her. Plus, considering how young she is, I'm not sure what her chances are were winning the game anyway, but she was still an interesting figure on the season, so because of that, I have her here at number 14. And with that, we are now moving to the 13 people still in the game, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think it is that they'll win the game from this point. But at number 13, the person I think is the least likely to win is Roxroy. And once again, I can't believe that there was actually a point in the season where I had a Roxroy relatively high, but he has really dropped off quite a bit. Where in this past episode, Romeo talks about being annoyed by him, Swati proposes pulling him in as a number to get rid of Drea, Tori talks to him where he has a confessional about not trusting Tori, but she tells him about Drea's extra vote. He then tells Drea that Tori told him about the extra vote, making Drea not trust Tori, has a confessional later on about losing the immunity challenge, calls the tribe a disaster, but insists that'll be an easy tribal as Tori can't be trusted and can't keep a secret. And ultimately, he sticks with Swati and is blindsided, technically speaking. And overall, this was a pretty bad episode for Roxroy. The negativity at the beginning felt completely unnecessary, and the fact that it came from someone he's supposedly aligned with is pretty bad, and it actually made me think for a time that he could have been the boot this episode, although ultimately that didn't end up happening. In addition, he doesn't get his way with the vote. Now, I can't see why he told Drea that Tori told him about the extra vote, as he thought that would have caused Drea to target Tori, but by the end, he is blindsided when Swati, someone he was very close to and someone he voted to save, is sent out. Now, I can kind of see why he voted for Tori, even if he knew about the shot in the dark, as maybe he wanted to guarantee Tori would go out if the shot worked, but I think it was unnecessary, as Tori likely would have been the backup target on a revote anyway, even if the shot worked. And with Tori still in the game, it really sets him up as a potential easy boot. He's really an outlier at this point. And at this point, Roxroy is in such a bad position, and I feel like that Romeo confessional was pretty bad for him, and I wouldn't be surprised if Roxroy was the next boot if he could go back to tribal pre-merge, but we'll have to see. And even aside from that, his storyline of him learning to adapt and really being more involved has really gone to nowhere. And in fact, I think this episode kind of undermines that to a great degree. So because of that, I have Roxroy here at number 13. Now we're moving on to number 12, and this is someone who I also think has no shot of winning. We have Lydia. And it's a shame that Lydia gets no content this episode, as again, she was one of the targets at the previous tribal, and she could have gotten credit for saving herself. Instead, all that credit went to Hai, and she really gets no screen time afterwards dealing with the fallout after tribal. Again, Hai really takes the lead here in like smoothing things over and getting Mike on their side. So I think this is all really bad for Lydia, and it's really making me think she has no shot of winning. Mind you, I think she has more longevity in the game than Roxroy, as she at least is technically in the majority now and is in a decent position on her tribe. But it's the fact that she got no credit for saving herself. We didn't really hear anything from her at all in this past episode. Really bad sign, and I feel like there's not really much going for her edit wise. So because of that, I have her here at number 12. Now we're moving on to number 11, and I did juggle these next couple spots a little bit, but I decided to go with the person who probably is being more set up for an immediate boot, and here we have Daniel. And I felt like this was a pretty bad episode for Daniel, where obviously his main content comes at the beginning of the episode, right at the tribal, where he tells everyone right away that he's not willing to discuss what happened, wanting to wait until morning. And to me, that is such a bad move for him, as I get what he's saying and that more of the work is done like in the days after tribal as emotions are so high. Even so, I feel like the fact that he's just abdicating that role of getting the ball rolling and really leaving other people to fill that gap is really bad. And we see that where obviously he gets a confessional saying it was a disaster to trust Chanel as much as he did, really undermining Chanel even further, really doubling down on this narrative that Chanel is untrustworthy. He felt like she didn't have his back during the deadlock. He feels like he screwed everything up. And then Hai called him spineless in confessional afterwards, which is also really bad. Mike approaches him about how he played him at the last tribal, and I feel like Daniel didn't defend himself super well there. He tells him he may have made a decision, but doesn't really own up to it that much. And I feel like through that, he just makes himself even more sneaky in Mike's eyes. And ultimately, we see Hai make the move of pulling in Mike to his side. Now, granted, Mike still doesn't have a vote, so who knows what that will lead to if they go back to tribal before that idol is activated. But it's still a really bad look for Daniel at the end of the day. He has a confessional again about how he got exposed while Chanel's getting no blowback for her bad gameplay. He's hoping the game will change on a dime. And while we do see them win immunity, we don't really see any follow-up for that in this episode. I feel like the game changing on a dime is more so Hai and Lydia getting Mike on their side than anything else. So if anything, I feel like this was a pretty bad episode for Daniel on the whole. And again, I feel like if they go back to tribal, I feel like Daniel is in a lot of danger right there. Now, granted, I think if he does manage to make it to the merge, I think he could slide by a little bit. But even then, it's not looking great for him. And while I can see other people potentially being earlier boots than him, I feel like it's still not great for him if Vati goes back to tribal. So because of that, I have him here at number 11. Now we're moving on to number 10. And similar to last week, I feel like this person is similar to Daniel in that they're in a bad position, but may have a bit more longevity. However, they still don't really have much of a story for a win. And we have Chanel here. And again, I feel like this wasn't a great episode for Chanel either, where obviously she tells Daniel she's disappointed in him for throwing her under the bus, has a confessional giving her perspective on the matter, which I do think is a little good. Even so, it's not really too much. I mean, she feels like she did nothing to change the plan. While it was her to get rid of Lydia, she can't admit to that. So she goes around defending herself at camp and saying Daniel blew up his own game rather than her convincing him to put the vote on the Lydia. And I feel like, again, while this is technically a better episode for Chanel than it was for Daniel, I'm still not feeling great about her. I feel like she's still in a pretty bad spot. And of course, Daniel gets plenty to say about Chanel on his end, so it's not exceptionally great at the end of the day either. I'm not feeling great about either of them really, but I feel like Chanel has a bit more outs moving forward, so because of that, I have her here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and I feel like my opinion on this person's game hasn't changed too much, but obviously they did survive this past tribal, and here we have Tori. And again, I feel like Tori isn't winning this game either, but has a bit more of a storyline for her. In episode 4, she calls Jonathan a Goliath while on the mat. Swati talks to her after the reward challenge about the vote. While she isn't a fan of Roxroy, she trusts Swati. She talks to Roxroy about Drea's extra vote. He has a confessional calling Roxroy a narcissist who thinks he's better than everyone, which is something, I guess. Even so, she knows that she needs Roxroy to get rid of Drea. Roxroy asks Tori about Drea's potential advantage from the summit, which leads Tori to tell Roxroy about Drea's extra vote, which she hadn't told him about. Roxroy says he doesn't particularly trust her. Ultimately, this blows up in Tori's face when Roxie tells Daree about the extra vote, causing Daree and Swati to not trust her. When Romeo approaches her later on, she defends herself, saying Swati was the one to tell her about Daree's extra vote. Daree and Romeo then approach her about a potential Swati blindside, has a confessional about how this is a step up for her and how she's willing to take it. And ultimately, she goes along with the plan and votes out Swati. And overall, this was an alright episode for Tori. Obviously, I don't think she was going home in this episode given her edit, but also because the promos spoiled her finding the Beware advantage, but whatever. She's once again shown being a messy player and her generally not being trusted, but as I discussed before, I think she has a storyline for the pre-merge where she's an underdog scraping her way from the bottom and surviving the Ika tribe, and this episode gave us a decent development in that narrative, with her getting on board with the Swati plan. With Roxie sticking by Swati as well, Tori could have some cover if she goes at the tribal pre-merge. Even so, she is not winning this season. She's gotten so much screen time on her surviving the Ika tribe that I think that's going to be her main purpose on the season. And I feel like she's primed to be taken out either at the last tribal before the merge or shortly afterwards. Now, I don't think she's gotten a traditional merge boot edit the same way someone else will be talking about soon has. But even so, I'm not feeling great about her longevity. Now, the Beware advantage could complicate things. I feel like that could give her some longevity. But even then, I feel like at most she is getting a journey at it where she is growing as she goes along, surviving through the game, but not really being in a position to win the game, even if she gets to the end. People still don't really trust her, and I don't really feel confident that she can get into a strong position moving forward. So because of that, I have her here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and I know this is probably going to be controversial as there are definitely people in the Edge community and the Survivor community who love this person and think they are a dark horse to win, but I just don't really see at this point. Here we have Lindsay. And again, I don't really see Lindsay as a winner contender in my eyes. I mean, in this past episode, she has a confessional about how dominant the Taku tribe has been at the challenge, insists that they have a massive advantage in terms of getting food from the reward. But aside from that, no real content. I mean, she does talk a bit with Jonathan, but I feel like Jonathan gets most of the content anyway. And overall, I'm just not feeling great about Lindsay. And again, I noticed there are a lot of Lindsay defenders out there. And while I kind of understand where they're coming from, I don't really agree with them. Obviously, I know I was previously low on Jonathan, and we'll get to Jonathan later, only to find out later that he did have a case to make. And that could be the case with Lindsay as well, but I'm just not seeing it right now. I think my biggest issue with her is that while she is on Taku, which I consider the complex tribe, she's the least developed character there. While we know she's close to Jonathan, we also know Jonathan is close to other people, particularly Omar, and she's also the only Taku member to have not received any personal content despite having a somewhat consistent presence on the show. And in many ways, her edit is reminiscent of Sydney for me, where she's getting consistent content, but I feel like it's not really leading to much, and through that makes me think that she could be the merge boot or the victim of the hourglass. That's not a really great sign to be in. I feel like there are a lot of similarities between Lindsay's edit and Sydney's. Obviously, Lindsay is a bit more positive, but still, it's the idea that she's getting consistent content, but not content that has a lot of purpose for me. And I feel like that's the main thing weighing me down with Lindsay. Now, again, I could be wrong later on. It could turn out that she is a top contender, maybe under the radar, but I'm just not seeing it right now. And I know there are people out there who think that she is a top contender, and if I'm wrong, then I'll admit that I'm wrong. But until I see evidence to the contrary, I can't have her too high. She is here at number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7. And before this previous week, I believe I had this person as the highest ranked person on Ika, but I feel like after this, I feel like I shifted them down a little bit. But here we have Daree, and this was an okay episode for Daree, but not the best, where obviously in episode 4, Swati is thinking of targeting her due to her extra vote, while Tori attempts to undermine Daree by telling Roxie about the extra vote. Roxie tells her about this, causing Daree to not trust Tori. She has a confessional about how Tori is at the bottom. Romeo proposes a Swati plan to her, has a confessional about how she doesn't trust Swati anymore, approaches Romeo and Tori with the Swati plan, has a confessional about how Tori has been sneaky and how it's hard to make a decision, but ultimately votes out Swati. And overall, this episode highlights Daree's solid position on the tribe, where despite being a leader figure, people are unwilling to target her or even undermine her, as demonstrated by the extra vote business. and she gets the credit for being the swing vote at Tribal. Even so, I wouldn't call this an exceptionally positive episode for Daree either, as I feel like Romeo gets a lot of credit for devising the Swati plan. Even Tori gets a bit of content with her using the vote to get off the bottom, and ultimately this reinforces my belief that she'll be a big player, but not someone that'll actually win. Again, I think Drea could be in for a while. I said earlier that I feel like if a Drea and Swati battle were to happen, that Drea would probably win, and sure enough, that did. However, I'm not feeling great about her. And I guess if we're sticking with analogies to 41, I feel like Drea is very similar to Shan in a lot of ways. Obviously, she hasn't gotten as much personal content as Shan, and obviously through that, that's not particularly great, but I feel like she's supposed to be a similar figure on this cast where she is more or less the center of the tribe. But I'm still feeling great about her gameplay wise, not so great edit wise. So because of that, I have her here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and this person has been all over the place on this power ranking. They've been high, they've been low, they've been in the middle. And obviously this week they did move up quite a bit from this past week. I have no idea what this person is at this point, to be honest, but I feel like they are on paper playing a decent enough game. But here we have Romeo. And I feel like this was an okay episode for Romeo, where in episode 4, he has a confessional about Roxie being the oldest one on the tribe and how he wants to be the father figure. He's willing to do anything to get to the end, even if it involves listening to Roxie's coaching and advice. Deep down, he wishes Roxie would shut up. After the challenge, tells Tori about her earlier conversation. After Tori says Swati told her about the extra vote, has a confessional about how Swati has been playing the game and how she can't be trusted. Approaches Drea about the Swati plan. It turns out Swati told both him and Drea that she's their number 1. The two of them agree that Swati is a dangerous player, and ultimately they vote her out. And overall, this was an okay episode for Romeo. I don't think it's ideal that he's complaining about Roxroy, as it was previously established that he wasn't in an alliance with him. He does make up for it to an extent by saying that tolerating it indicates he's willing to do anything to get to the end, though I also find that an interesting word choice. So does that mean he'll be a losing finalist? I don't know. Later on, though, he is propped up by getting credit for putting together the Swati plan. That at least is a positive for him, but despite this being a somewhat good episode for him, I feel like there are just too many holes in his edit at this point for him to be a winner. Again, I feel like his episodes 2 and 3 have been pretty lackluster, and while he had an okay enough premiere and a good enough episode here, I think he's not a winner. Now, I do think this episode does establish longevity for him. I feel like he could be an endgamer, but I feel like I'm not super confident at him actually winning. So because of that, I had to leave him here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and as a spoiler alert, this is the same top 5 that I had last week. It's just a matter of the order, and the order did change a bit from this past week. But at number 5, we have one of the Taku members. We have Marion. And this was an okay episode for Marion, where she obviously has a confessional about the reward and how good it is, which is kind of okay. Has a confessional about being mad at Jonathan for talking about unity at the mat, but then again, other people also talked about that, and says the phrase once again at the immunity challenge, but no one else speaks up, and has a confessional complaining about that. And overall, this was an okay episode for her. I mean, this was just a largely character-based episode for Marion. I'm still not feeling great about her as a winner, but again, she is supposed to be a fan favorite based on what we've seen. And I do have the feeling she's probably at the bottom of Taku, where if they do go back to tribal pre-merge, then I think Marion has a decent shot being voted out. Now, I don't think that will actually happen. You know, like, even though me saying Lindsay would be the merge boot more likely than her, I feel like that indicates that Taku is probably not going back to tribal before the merge, and especially not with, well, Jonathan. But I feel like Marion will probably be in it for a while, but probably not win. And I know people have said that there's a good chance she could actually flip, considering she is at the bottom of Taku right now, so we'll have to stay tuned for that. But I still feel like she'll be in for a while, even if she's not going to win, so I have her here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and this person did move up a bit from last week, and this was a somewhat notable episode for them, and here we have Jonathan. And again, I am starting to see Jonathan more as a legitimate contender, even if this episode arguably wasn't the best for him, but we'll get to that into a second. Obviously, in episode 4, he once again dominates the reward challenge, again, really highlighting his physical ability. Tells Jeff on the mat that Taku has a lot of unity, which is a big factor to them being strong in challenges. Later on, Tori calls him a Goliath. Hai also refers to him as a challenge beast. After the challenge, talks to the tribe about how he regrets his speech for pinning a target on Taku's back. As others express their annoyance, we see he also regrets it. He talks to Lindsay about it and how he knows he's a shield for other people. He then gets an individual intro package where he talks about his physical strength, his background. He knows he can offer service to his tribe by being strong physically and dominating challenges, and it was a nice segment for him. Overall, I think this was a mostly positive episode for Jonathan. Now, obviously, the post reward segment wasn't great, where we hear most of the tribe criticize his mad speech, including his allies, saying it paints a bigger target on their back moving forward, which does make sense, and it's not great that that was shown on the show. However, I think it was a decent enough launch pad for Jonathan to have his personal content and him acknowledging that he's a shield. So even though we got the negativity, we still got to hear his perspective on the matter. And to that end, I think he is a legitimate contender, despite my initial reservations about him. With that said, he is not the top contender though, as I still feel like he has been getting too much content during the challenges specifically. Jeff has really highlighted his physical ability over and over again, really taking the time to establish just how good he is at challenges. And while that is presented positively, it's still more content that I'm comfortable with, and it just makes me think he will be targeted moving forward. Now, to his credit, I think if he does need to win out, he's probably more capable of doing so than really most other challenge beasts in the history of Survivor. I mean, some of that is due to the fact that this cast is physically weaker than normal, but it's also due to him being head over shoulders above everyone else. I feel like he is more dominant in challenges than Ozzy was on Cook Islands, or even Joe on Worlds Apart, as at least, like Ozzy and Cook Islands had Yule to compete against. At least Joe was up against Mike in Worlds Apart, and then later on, people like Jeremy and Stephen Fishback to an extent, and Spencer Bledsoe in Cambodia. So I think they at least had more competition than Jonathan, where Jonathan, who is his competition really in physical competitions? Maybe not in puzzles, and I feel like that could be an issue for him after the merge, but I feel like if we're just talking about physical challenges, he has no competition at all. So I think that could mean he could win out if he needs to, and I think the positivity is highlighting that possibility. But I still feel like he is getting a lot of content, and I feel like he will be a target in the merge. So those reservations are enough to keep him from the top spot. But I feel like number 4 is still a good place for him. So I have him here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and I've never seen this person as a top contender, but they've gotten a lot of good stuff. And here we have High. Now the thing about High is, while I never really seen him as a top contender, he has gotten consistent content in every episode and pretty good content at that. And this was the same in this episode where after the tribal, he tells the tribe that despite voting going his way, he feels like the entire tribe has blindsided him. He has a confessional about how most of the tribe was blindsided at tribal, including himself. He tells Daniel that Chanel and Daniel told him to vote for him while he chose to stick with Jenny. He says at Tribal, he shifted the game in his favor after Daniel screwed up by sticking with Lydia and causing the vote to go his way. Gets a lot of credit there. He says Daniel has no backbone, which was pretty brutal in my opinion. He offers Mike a deal to work with him and Lydia, which he agrees to. After the reward challenge, has a confessional about Taku's dominance in challenges, but aside from that, no content. And I feel like on the whole, again, High has gotten pretty good content in every episode. Again, he had a good premiere, not the best in that he was shown being pretty game body. Episode 2, he obviously gets the personal content there. Episode 3, he is shown getting his way at Tribal, and in episode 4, he does take credit for his maneuvers at Tribal, though I have talked about before how it wasn't the most impressive display in the world. It was more so Daniel being so bad that caused him to get his way, but still, he is able to pivot that in his favor, and we see him getting the credit for putting the alliance together of him, Lydia, and Mike, despite Lydia being the one in danger. And I mentioned earlier how Lydia got no content in this episode, no credit for saving herself, while High got all the credit here, and that's definitely true with High. Really makes him look good at the end of the day. He's one of the few people who has gotten consistent content in every episode, and consistently good content as well. I think the main thing that keeps me from putting him at the top is that some of it does feel a bit disjointed, where, again, I feel like the episode 1 content and the episode 2 content don't really gel well together, in my opinion, to where I could see people saying that he could just be another big player taken out later on. But I feel like he hasn't been as overexposed as a lot of other people, which does make me feel pretty confident in him as a whole. But I feel like the top 2 people are either more conventional picks or people who, again, have still gotten pretty good content on the whole and content that I feel is more unified than what High has demonstrated. So because of that, I have High here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and we actually have the same top 2 as last week, and believe it or not, it's actually the same order as well. But number 2, we have Mike. And I'm still feeling pretty good about Mike, where, I mean, this wasn't the best episode for him, but also wasn't that bad, where in episode 4, he tells High that Daniel ruined his trust, has a confessional about how Daniel screwed him over, but now he needs to adapt. He's in survival mode. High offers to have him work with him and Lydia, which he agrees to. Later on, he approaches Daniel about how he played him. Daniel defends himself, but I feel like Mike definitely comes out of the situation better, where, again, I feel like Daniel doesn't do that well either. But on the whole, I feel like Mike has been getting pretty good content, where he is shown being a pretty consistent presence on the show. I feel like we see him being included in the alliance, and his beware advantage, the fact that he still can't vote, wasn't really highlighted as a negative either. I feel like the fact that High and Lydia are willing to flip him over demonstrates his ability in the game. He talks about the need to adapt after being in the bottom of the vote, which I think is somewhat impressive. And I think this was a decent enough cooldown for him. I mean, he still gets some credit to an extent for turning on Daniel, who is definitely not supposed to be presented positively at all. And I feel like he definitely has the potential to be a bigger player moving forward. I feel like the main thing keeping him from being number 1 is the fact that he is not on the complex tribe. You know, like, I feel like Taku has been the complex tribe. Whereas Vati, I feel like he easily has the best shot of anyone on Vati. Now, I think High is probably getting closer to him, but I feel like those two are clearly the most likely to win from Vati. But it's the fact that Vati is not the complex tribe that keeps me from putting a member from there on number 1. So because of that, I leave Mike here at number 2. And now at number 1, and it's the same number 1 as last week, it is Omar. Now, to be honest, this wasn't even the best episode for Omar, where he obviously has a confessional about how John did some Matt speech and him being annoyed by that for making the tribe a bigger target. Even so, he still calls Jonathan invaluable to the tribe. And overall, like I said, I don't think this was the best episode for him. I don't think it's a great look for him to be talking negatively about Jonathan when Jonathan's supposed to be one of his closest allies. Even so, again, for one, he does qualify to some extent. But I feel like he is probably the best positioned person on Taku right now, which is the complex tribe, in my opinion. And I think that's really the main thing elevating him right now, where, to be honest, I feel like Kai and Mike are probably starting to catch up for him a bit. And I've talked about this before, how with Omar being a quote unquote more conventional pick, that probably isn't the best sign for him at the end of the day. But I still feel like with him having the content still being a consistent presence on the show, and him being on the complex tribe, I feel like that is enough to make me feel good about him. So because of that, I'm here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out the channel. Australian Survivor is about to wrap up, so obviously with that, I'm going to be doing a review and player ranking for that, stay tuned for that. BB Can is in full swing right now. We're about halfway through that season as well, so that should be fun. And of course, Survivor is going on as usual. And I do plan to make other types of videos moving forward, things talking more generally about Survivor, like things that I haven't really had time to do due to the schedule. So hopefully that stuff will come out soon. Stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. See ya.